the session has been opened. So we will start session 6 on neoliberalism's appearance and machinations. We have 5 papers in the sessions, and the first one will be presented by Professor Carlos Aguiar de Medeiros, and the title of his presentation is Failures of Neoliberalism in Brazil.
Thank you very much. I will put my, you see that? Okay.
Yes.
This is a paper I wrote with my colleague, Nicholas Treba. The broad idea is that Brazil's post-war economic history may be divided into 2 broad periods. Let me, 2 broad periods. A developmental age from the 50s and the 80s characterized by high levels of growth and public investment, and a neoliberal age in which, despite significant different social priorities adopted by conservative and labor governments in this period, public investment and growth slowed considerably. Just to see this this connection between real GDP growth and public investment and all of that. Well, the phase of neoliberalism in Brazil can be considered in different phases. For instance, the neoliberal era can be divided into distinct phases. Phase 1, from the 80 to 89, was one of balance of payment-induced and high inflation and austerity, and coincided with a transition to democracy and into more than 20 years of military dictatorship. Neoliberalism as an outright policy regime began in the 90s, and this lasted until 2003. It was a period of triumphant neoliberalism under Washington consensus reforms. Tariffs were cut, capital controls were removed, and hundreds of state-owned enterprises were sold off in a privatization process heavily subsidized by the state. It had some political appeal in the mid-90s because the stabilization of exchange rate credited to neoliberal policies had put an end to the hyperinflation of the early 90s. But this political appeal, along with the popularity of Brazil's main neoliberal party, the Brazilian Social Democratic Party, went into free fall after 98. After another balance of payment crisis from 98 to 2002, the Workers' Party was elected. Better export price and huge amounts of capital inflows released the balance of payment constraint and made possible a third way, a sort of now developmentalism as an alternative. This was phase 3 between 2004 and 2014. It maintained key aspects of neoliberal macroeconomic policy, like fiscal targets and open financial account, but used minimum wage policy, public investment, and social spending to stimulate growth and redistribute income. Particularly, it gave higher priorities to public enterprise. The final phase of neoliberalism in Brazil from 2015 to present is alternative neoliberalism. The Workers' Party was removed from power in a parliamentary coup, and the interim government, enthusiastically supported by big business, introduced labor market reforms in a radical austerity program. After collapsing in 2015 and 16, the economy has stagnated under right-wing government committed to a radical attack on institutions, dismantling developmental organizations that had to survive. Our objective here in this paper was to examine social and power coalitions that may contribute to explain the crisis of developmentalism and the persistence of neoliberalism in spite of a mediocre economic and social results. Well, this is a very important book for this paper. I assume this. In the rise and the fall of neoliberal capitalism, made by David Colt. Argus, neoliberalism was introduced in the United States as the result of a new political coalition between big business and a small and medium-sized enterprise, which isolated organized labor politically. In Brazil, the balance of payment crisis of the 80s unified the different fractions of the bourgeoisie and politically isolated the developmentalism coalition. Later, after a decade in which under labor governments implemented a number of developmental policies, an alliance of business against the state was again formed, unifying the various fractions of the country's dominant classes. In order to grasp the main similarities and differences of this regime in Brazil, we must consider along this different phase the dimensions of the country's economic sectors, the different fractions of the dominant classes, and the different strategies followed by this. The developmental era from the 50s to 80s was led by a technical bureaucracy. It was formed by a triad capital structure, formed by state-owned enterprise in finance, public utilities, and in capital goods, and two broad private economic groups that remain the dominant force in Brazilian politics. The associated or internationalized bourgeoisie has close ties to foreign markets, investors, and control assets in finance, media, segments of manufacturing, agribusiness, and various service sectors. The internal bourgeoisie is oriented toward the domestic market and holds assets mainly in manufacture, agribusiness, engineering, and construction. These groups overlap somewhat, but they can be distinguished by the types of economic policy they support. The basic difference between the two is that the internal bourgeoisie relies on tariffs, subsidy loans, and other select industrial policies to remain profitable, while the internationalized bourgeoisie alliance with foreign capital supports a full neoliberal agenda. Internal bourgeoisie, which includes some subsidiaries of multinational corporations, was a hegemonic force in Brazilian politics during the developmental era. The hegemony was weakened by the recession of the 80s and by the pressure of the Brazilian government throughout this decade by creditor countries relinquish its industrial policies and the role it had played in economic development through state-owned enterprise. This, combined with a powerful resurgence of trade union activity and a very progressive constitution approved in 1988, convinced the internal bourgeoisie to join the internationalized bourgeoisie in defense of financial and deregulation and privatization. Balance of main problems provided a crucial ideological justification for the introduction of neoliberalism in the 90s. But trade liberalization and denationalization harmed domestic industry and led the internal bourgeoisie to complain about neoliberal trade and monetary policies in the mid-90s. These complaints turned into significant policy change with the victory of the Labour Party, the PT, and the presidential election of 2002. Favorable world economic conditions led to the formation of a new political coalition by the internal bourgeoisie and supported the Brazilian workers and for the poor. This evolution suggests the existence of a fragile class alliance under both developmentalism and neoliberalism. This fragility creates a kind of pendulous political cycle. This is a very important idea from the Argentinian Guillermo O'Donnell has put many years ago, with shifts occurring when the poor economic results of orthodox policies or slow down in world economic growth weaken the power of certain fractions of the bourgeoisie and permit an increase in the influence of others. Something along these lines has taken place in Brazil since the 80s And likewise, this pendulum movement occurred in the last 2 decades when the government was led by the workers' parties. The swings of the political pendulum depends in part on world economic conditions. When foreign exchange is scarce, neoliberal interests become more powerful. When external finance is abundant, the internal bourgeoisie becomes more willing to form pacts with workers. This is what I say that the brief golden age in Brazil. World economic growth and high commodity price after 2003 made it easier for the PT to justify spending on infrastructure and social welfare. And the Workers' Party used government loans through National Bank, BNDES, this is very important, National Development Bank, Petrobras investments, and protectionist policies to promote the interests of national champions within the internal bourgeoisie. From this period until 2004 and 2010, period was the most successful in recent Brazilian history. Wage and employment grew significantly and income inequality and poverty diminished. Private investment grew substantially, and although the direction of economic policy prioritized the interests of internal bourgeoisie, all the fraction of capital prospered, particularly the financial sector. President Lula finished his final term in 2010 with very high levels of popular approval, and the PT easily won the 3rd consecutive presidential election. The high growth of 2000s has made Brazilian workers much stronger. Strike activity in 2011 and until 14 reached a high level. In response to business pressure, the government attempted to contain aggregate demand growth after 2010 and attempt to use tax incentives and other supply-side policies to maintain growth. This policy failed and output growth fell considerably between 2011 and 14, but real wage kept growing. It's important to note here that the internationalized bourgeoisie was always opposed to PT and used its influence in Congress, the media, and the Attorney General office to weaken the party and implicate in corruption scandals. The internal bourgeoisie was powerful enough to defend the Labour Party against many of these accusations until 2010, but a series of events after this year weakened the political position of the internal bourgeoisie and the support for Workers' Party turned in a more neoliberal direction. Government was and PT was in a very vulnerable position after 2013. In 2014, it won more one presidential election, but in this year, it became the object of an aggressive judicial attack called Operation Car Wash, led by the upper middle class judges and prosecutors allied with mass media and the U.S. Department of Justice as well. The Industry Association of São Paulo, the main organ representing the interests of internal bourgeoisie, began to support a regime change. The government made a desperate attempt to stay in power by appeasing big business, imposing harsh fiscal austerity in 2015. This led to economic collapse. By mid-2015, planning was underway for a pro-business coup d'etat to overthrow the PT government. The interim government that assumed power in early 2016 quickly implemented a broad neoliberal agenda beneficial to multinational corporations and big business in general. A right-wing government committed to neoliberalism was elected in 2018, and the economy has stagnated before collapsing again in 2020 with the pandemic. And I conclude. In the beginning of the century, the conflicts within the dominant class made it possible for the internal bourgeoisie to form a pact with workers' parties during the era of neodevelopmentalism. Though brings substantial benefits to Brazil's poor and marginalized classes, this alliance became very unstable because of the inherent conflict of interest between workers and capital. Presently, the unification of bourgeoisie on the issues of privatization and deregulation provide the political basis for radical neoliberalism. But the neoliberal regime is also very unstable, partly because of the low growth and poor social outcomes caused by it, but also because not all fractions of the dominant classes support a full neoliberal agenda. Maybe a pendulum is coming, but I don't know this very well. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Carlos. We can follow now to the second paper on Thorstein, Veblen and the Emergence of Neoliberalism of John Battaile Hall and Jenica Mary Kramer. I think Jenica is going to present the paper, but maybe John, do you want to say some words regarding the panel?
Yeah, thank you. Jenica and I started into this topic about a year ago, and we were meeting regularly to discuss it. And then I thought it was best to let her go ahead and have a free hand and write up her ideas. And so it's in order that she presents this paper.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for including me in this session. This is very exciting for me. So I will begin. So I've set out to establish that the institution of private property forms the basis for ecological disaster. The profit seeking of the vested interests, in conjunction with their modes of valuing nature through the apparatuses of neoclassical economics and through neoliberalism, proceed to degrade and destroy life on Earth. So I also would like to kind of have this be a little bit of a call to arms of the original institutional economics school of thought to address the ecological crisis. I think that there is a lot that institutional economics can contribute to this giant issue. You know, this is in my opinion, this is the defining issue of our age. So let's see. So this presentation will attempt to address what to us appears to be either overlooked or underexplored in the two fields that I think are most engaged with the ecological question right now, which are political economy and ecological economics. They both seek to address the underlying causes and emergent complications of this unfolding and interconnected social and ecological crisis. So basically, what I'm setting out to say is that the usurpation of society's surplus production or the accumulation of capital is a parasite that sustains itself not only through the exploitation of human labor, but by exploiting society and nature more broadly, resulting in the deterioration of life itself. The transformation of the obvious predator that pursues power through pecuniary gain into a parasite undetected by its host is realized in its most rapacious form, I argue, in the global hegemonic system of neoliberal capitalism. So I have a literature review that I think is kind of necessary for engaging in this topic. So I'm going to go through a few different texts that I think are at the forefront of this conversation right now. To begin, I would like to make the case for examining a paper by Daniel A. Underwood that was published in the JEI in 1998, excuse me, titled "The Institutional Origins of Crisis for Economy and Ecology." This is a wonderful paper. I think, you know, it was published around kind of the same time that a lot of ecological economics was taking off as a field. So Underwood begins by defining some basic concepts in the field of ecological economics. So we need to understand what the throughput is. So the throughput of energy and matter first extracted from and then returned to what we will call the biosphere, or the earth, nature, is transformed by a provisioning process that constitutes what Underwood refers to as the econosphere. So for Underwood, the joint crises for economy and ecology identified in his paper stem from the fact that the econosphere, or as he puts it, capitalism as an institutionally directed evolutionary pathway, necessitates an ever-increasing throughput of energy and matter for its survival. So, I mean, this basically is the contradiction famously addressed in the book The Limits to Growth from 1972 by Danilo Meadows et al. It was published by the Club of Rome. It's a really fundamental text to ecological economics. So basically, there can't be unlimited growth on a finite planet. That's the inherent contradiction that we are dealing with, I would say, right now. So, therefore, I think we need to really address what unlimited, we need to address economic growth and this orientation towards unlimited growth that the capitalist system is, orients towards. So in doing so, Underwood points to the institution of private property. And I think that we absolutely need to not just look at economic growth, but look at what drives economic growth. What is underneath economic growth? What are the social relations that orient towards growth? So private property, as an inherently exclusionary set of habitually conditioned rules and behaviors, effectively denies the universal access to the necessities of life. The capitalistic system, based on a so-called natural right to property, is not organized to direct the throughput or to provision energy and materials effectively to meet the welfare of all members of society. Rather, as Underwood states, it is organized to inflate the prestige and the power of the vested interests. He writes that as the predominant institutional force in the provisioning process, production only occurs if profits are forthcoming. So production does not, in fact, occur to provide for the basic means necessary for life, for society, or to improve the well-being of the members of society, but to, increase the power of the vested interests. So I'm going to kind of jump ahead a little bit. On this question of unlimited growth, in questioning unlimited growth, which is, something that has been, as global warming has, increased in intensity and ecological disaster over the last 20 years and more, people have started to question this orientation towards growth. In response to that, there's been this push towards green growth. Well, what about green growth? Can we keep the economy growing, but make it sustainable? Make it green. We'll plant trees, everything will be fine. Which I elect is just neoliberalism trying to continue its, the pecuniary mission of the vested interests, under a guise of being green and ecological and whatnot. So the next text I would like to address is by Jason Hickel and Yorgos Kallis, titled "Is Green Growth Possible?" And it was published recently in 2020. They set out to complete, they did a thorough examination of empirical research, and they came up with the answer: no, it's not. There's no way to decouple, is what the term is, to decouple the material throughput of the economy from economic growth. So basically, in order to perpetuate growth, you're always going to have to incorporate more material from the earth, from the environment. And it's, it's just, they say it's physically impossible to maintain economic growth in the long run. So, okay, I'm going to jump ahead again. Another paper by Elke Pergmeyer and Julia K. Seinberger question what has, in their view, now become a fixation on growth in the field of ecological economics and political ecology. All of this talk about growth is, can we have infinite growth? Let's just make it green. Like, what is growth? Blah, blah, blah. So in their words, the field of ecological economics might itself be caught up in a growth fetish. Their concern is that ecological economists, may overemphasize growth in economic and biophysical terms at the expense of underpinning social drivers of ecological destruction. So what they argue is that growth is an outcome of the capitalist system, not its underlying imperative. So to address these underlying system dynamics, these authors suggest turning to Marxist political economy, whereas Professor Hall and I would like to propose that we turn to Veblen and see what insights he might have into this question of growth and what is underneath growth. Right. So what is underneath growth, we say, is the institution of private property, which is animated by the profit-seeking of a predatory culture to the detriment of the community at large. And that is what is to blame for the overshoot of the econosphere into the ecosphere, past the biological limits of the ecosphere. So the problem is not simply growth, but the problem, I attest, is private gain at the expense of the social and ecological systems of the planet, or the misalignment of the provisioning process with social and ecological need. I'm doing on time. So, okay, so the next, I will do this really quick. Okay, so the next paper is published by Robert Fletcher and Bram Boucher in 2017, titled The PES Conceit, Revisiting the Relationship Between Payments for Ecosystem Services and Neoliberal Conservation. So payments for ecosystem services is a popular method of bringing nature into the market in order to value it. In the neoclassical system, there's no way to value clean air or clean water. So in order to, and so it gets polluted, it gets overexploited and whatnot. So in order to try and stop that, the neoliberal answer, which is dominated by the field of environmental economics, which is slightly different, is the marketization of nature, to bring nature into the market, to then make it valuable, say, oh, it's worth this much money, so we can save it now. So in this paper, Robert Fletcher and Boucher explained that despite there's been a lot of research saying that payments for ecosystem services actually, in practice on the ground, sometimes they don't tend towards marketization. It's not quite that way, but what Boucher and Fletcher are arguing that despite at the macro, or excuse me, on the micro level, they might not be selling trees outright, but there's still the privatization of forests going on, and the conceptualization of nature as a resource to be exploited is, it's like what they're arguing is these are steps towards marketization. So what they're arguing is that despite, on the ground, maybe market-based instruments aren't being used quite yet, but that doesn't mean that these programs are not tied to neoliberalism and to the marketization of nature and whatnot. So, okay, so I will get into Veblen now. I think I'm a little pressed for time, perhaps. Okay, so the fallacy of private property. What does Veblen have to say about private property? In The Beginnings of Ownership, published in 1898 by Veblen, he rejects the natural rights theory of property, which claims the rightful owner of something is naturally the person who produced it. To the contrary, Veblen understands that all production is in fact a production in and by the help of the community, and all wealth is such only in society. This worldview holds that it is the joint stock of knowledge of the community at large that makes production possible at all. And it is only through society that the transmission of technical knowledge, tools, cultural traditions, and customs can occur. There simply can be no production without this transmission of knowledge. Thus, there can be no such thing as individual production. And there can be no natural right to property either that is based on individual production. So it follows that the institution of private property is not a natural phenomenon, as the natural rights theory would suggest. It is a culturally constructed institution that is inherently bound to a notion of individualism that contradicts the very essence of society. This same line of thought can, and I will argue should, be extended to the planet and all of its life-giving processes, without which humans would not exist. Production could not occur, and there would be nothing to produce without an earth from which to produce it. Nature is inherently communal. A good reference point for this, I mean, you can look around, you know, you can you can see that the nature. I can see that, but Peter Kropotkin published the book Mutual Aid in 1902, which talks about how, you know, both like in species, you know, animals and plants work together for survival, and also like in between species, they also, you know, it's an ecology, you know, nature is ecological. So I'll argue that the institution of private property is actually unnatural in the real sense that it contradicts the very essence of nature, because it is anti-ecological, it is anti-communal, and nature is both of those things. So it is a natural fact that all of what is currently captured as physical private property will someday be returned to the earth through the entropic process. But for now, the institution of private property exists as a means of control that betrays the innately communal and ecological natures of existence. How am I doing on time? I'm a little...
You have 1 minute left.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't see you. You're okay. So I'll just the transformation of predator to parasite. Basically, when society, you know, when civilization came about, humans settled down. They learned how to cultivate food from the land, and a surplus product was created, right? So that's the basic story, you know, and it allowed for a predatory culture to prey upon that surplus product. So, you know, this comes straight out of Veblen. What Veblen notices around the time of the First World War, or sorry, yeah, is that the predatory culture is trying to transform from predator to parasite by using the institution of national pride, by convincing people, the common people, that that their predatory behavior, basically the accumulation of capital, is completely necessary for society. It's beneficial to society, and they do this through, you know, claiming that economic growth is beneficial to the country and to society as a whole. I will wrap up. I apologize for going a bit over on time, but hopefully there will be some questions in the discussion and I can answer them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenica and John. Now we're going to the following paper of Mary Wrenn and William Waller, and the title of their presentation is Both Babes and Predatory Optimism, Neoliberalism, Gender, and Multi-Level Marketing Schemes. William, you need to unmute yourself, please.
The paper addresses multi-level marketing and its targeting of women in the United States and internationally to serve as their distributors. They use the trope of defining these women as boss babes. Boss babes is a term used in the propaganda of multi-level marketing firms to refer to the women who are persuaded to become distributors for their firms. These women are offered the opportunity to earn income by becoming independent, flexible, direct-to-consumer salespeople who are persuaded that they epitomize the optimism, meritocracy, and work ethic particular to our current stage of capitalism, neoliberalism. MLMs have not attracted a great deal of attention from other feminist scholars, including economists. So there's some short history. Multi-level marketing schemes are pyramid schemes with a twist. They get around the illegality of pyramid schemes by selling an actual product. But structurally, it is the same as a pyramid scheme. Distributors make money not by selling the product, but by recruiting new distributors in a typical pyramid fashion. The results are the same, however. Early distributors in the pyramid make money, the promoters make money, but those lower in the pyramid almost always lose their money. The Federal Trade Commission defines a pyramid scheme as involving companies that promise consumers or investors large profits based primarily on recruiting others to join their program, not based on profits from any real investment or real sale of goods to the public. Some schemes may purport to sell a product, but they simply use the product to hide their pyramid structure. However, as long as a company does not require that new recruits buy large inventories and maintain some level of retail sales, then companies are able to avoid being defined as pyramid schemes under the law. The main issue, Jessica Wood, addressing this, said that the main issue, which I and many other people have with these companies, is that they claim to be supporting female entrepreneurs and feminism. Calling themselves boss babes and mantrapreneurs, they make outrageous claims such as 80% of women who earn over 6 figures a year are doing so through direct marketing. Now, estimates of earnings, profits, and losses from participating as a distributor in these organizations are hard to find. One estimate suggests 99.6% of participants are losing money. Another shows 99% of all distributors earn less than $13 a week. And AA, that's not AAUP, and AR, American Association of Retired People panel, survey found 77% of their respondents broke even or lost money. We want to look at the potency of neoliberalism and religion in this US culture. Mary Wrenn has analyzed Veblenian social practices, which help explain the appropriation of prosperity theology combined with neoliberal ideology to sustain the enabling myths employed by MLMs. She identifies conspicuous consumption, the tithe, invidious distinctions of faithfulness, and prosperity emulation as the Veblenian social practice is supporting the prosperity gospel. The elevation of the concept of autonomous individual to being the only normal expression of innate human nature is central to the enabling mythology of neoliberal ideology. In neoliberalism, the actions of the autonomous individual agent are the only causal factor in determining the economic or social outcomes the individual experiences. The prosperity gospel Christian believes that God has victory planned for her and that to receive it, she must act as though she has already received it. The believer must positively confess her trust and belief in God in order to activate into existence that which she is owed. Failure to receive comes from failure to believe adequately that one will receive in the new future what God has promised. So the first Veblenian social practice, conspicuous consumption, the tithe. The prosperity gospel teaches that the tithe, a financial contribution to the church, is a demonstration of faith. Depth of faith is therefore measurable and demonstrable through the act of tithing. More importantly, the prosperity gospel teaches that the tithe as an act of faith attracts prosperity. In multi-level marketing schemes, new recruits are encouraged to buy product up front to achieve the minimum level of sales, to move up to a higher level of distributor status, to achieve larger discounts, and to demonstrate their faith and commitment to the program, or in the language of the prosperity gospel, the tithe. The seed of faith is planted and the believer receives that for which she asks. The second Veblenian social practice is the invidious distinction of faithfulness. In the prosperity gospel, preachers claim to be role models, living example that God's abundance is awarded to the most able practitioners. They argue that their conspicuous displays of wealth provide evidence of the power of the prosperity gospel, as well as honor God and his beneficence. The world of multi-level marketing is one of predatory optimism. Those in the distributor network are provided resources, seminars, mentoring, and conventions for which they pay, all to assure them that if they push on and increase their effort at duplication, by which is meant adding more downstream distributors to their individual networks, their success is guaranteed. The third Veblenian social practice, prosperity emulation. In the doctrine of the prosperity gospel specifically states that the individual believer is exceptional in God's view. The proof is in the prosperity. That prosperity is measurable and thus comparable to others through wealth. In multi-level marketing celebratory conventions displaying the successes of distributors, celebrity endorsements, and well-publicized prizes and gifts for the successful distributors are classic conspicuous displays to serve as a prod to the attending distributors to emulate the successful distributors' strategies and work effort in building their distributor network. Notably absent in all of this promotion is any significant effort devoted to getting the distributors to actually engage in sales of the product to consumers. In Wrenn's exploration of Veblenian social practices, her conclusion rings as true for multi-level marketing as it does for the prosperity gospel preachers. Through these Veblenian social practices, individuals are socialized and habituated to deny the material reality of the failures of their faith. Veblen's propaganda of faith is particularly instructive here, as the prosperity theology is able to further mitigate doubt and fill its coffers by selling materials which promise and inspire the individual believer to improve her performance in those Veblenian social practices. Clearly, the management and top distributors of multi-level marketing firms are using the same Veblenian social practices as prosperity gospel preachers to sustain their predation on those who join the ranks of distributors who are destined to lose money for their benefit. As with any long con, multi-level marketing uses these social practices to make the hapless distributors complicit in their own fleecing. And I cede back the rest of my time.
Very good.
Okay, thank you very much for your paper. The following paper is Neoliberalism and its Failure in Mexico of Eugenia Correa. So please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for John Hall to invite us to have this important panel for our conference. I have my PowerPoint presentation. I want to share it. Okay, finally, in this with this uncertainty about what is happening in the middle of the year, we start to work with Laura Vidal about this new stage of the neoliberalism and what happened with the neoliberalism for 50 years of neoliberalism in society and markets in Latin America, in order to try to explain all the context of precisely of the pandemic. Then first I want we take this a half of century of the neoliberal counter-revolution and what happened, what we know that changed all around the world, our societies, and it is especially true that these concepts of Polanyi fictions, commodity, land, labor, and money become a very important issue in the neoliberalist policies. The reform of these fictions commodities have consolidated the markets of land, labor, and money. That's I think that it is useful to have the support of Polanyi and the institutionalism because I think that with Carlos and with Jenica, we have a lot of point of reinforce our view, our contributions. Then I want the parts of our paper is first I want to try to understand the reform, the neoliberal reforms in labor, land, and finance in Latin America. Just a few lines about it. Third, second, the opposition and the counter trends that we can find in all these 50 years in Latin America. And third, the financial and health 2020 crisis that really shows new stage or new limits or open a new stage of neoliberalism. Well, let me check what can I do with this. Okay. In labor, let's take in labor all the reforms that we can see in Latin American countries and especially in the major economies are work in about the flexibility of the so-called labor markets. Flexibilities in contracts, benefits, social security, health assets, wages, working hours, etc., etc. All these reforms were very unuseful in terms to achieve their main explicit objectives. Let's say create more employment, but they were very useful for advance the detachment from the world of the life for the life itself. That means that the workers don't have this proud and strong relationship with their own work, with their own employment, and really are completely, let's say, or it is a horrible part of their lives to work, to try to work or to have a job. The results of this, of course, of these labor flexibilities has been the instability and job insecurity that everybody underlined, the increase of the informal sector in our countries, and of course the unemployment. But maybe the main results that we need to understand deeply is that the worst moment of the daily life in Latin American workers is the moment in he developed his jobs. I remember recently a long discussion with sociologists, and they say that what you are demanding full employment precisely in the moment in which all the workers don't really want to work. They really prefer all this universal income that permit to completely get outside of the world, outside of the employment, and maybe not a very good life, but at least finish the torture of the job, of the employee. Well, in money, the reforms here, everybody knows, has been very strong, starting with the autonomy of the central banks, the international treaties that reaffirm the money as a commodity, of course, the transfer of the pension funds as part of the part of the wages of the workers to the pension funds that go directly to the financial markets. Nowadays in Latin American labor force plays more than $90 billion by year of their wages to the financial management in order to the so-called pension in the future, which is an illusion. Well, the second part of the work paper, it is about the opposition and counterterms. It is important to, for institutionalists as Carlos and everybody, underline the different kind of oppositions that the reforms create in Latin America in these 50 years of neoliberalism. Initially, the reforms opposition has been developed by trade unions, of course, middle classes, and even the elites of our countries that try, and this opposition was contained by the forces of the neoliberalism, especially the creditors, the IMF, and etc. With persuasions, partial compensation, threats, repression, or even coup d'etat. In the 80s, the most important dissatisfactions came from the elites of dissatisfaction with these reforms, neoliberal reforms, who saw their condition immediately threatened, especially with devaluations, falls in demand and income, and hyperinflation. But in the 80s, really, as the IMF say, was a lost decade for Latin America, but the losses were mainly for societies, for workers, and even the elites and the middle classes. In the 80s, a large part of the state economy was put in the service of the banks and financial investors, with all this privatization that we know. The growing opposition found again devastation of natural resource, destruction of urban spaces, deterioration of health and education systems, privatization of social security, and the opposition to pay illegitimate debt, etc. In the 21st century, the oppositions, well, the neoliberalism has achieved a complete success in Latin American countries, especially not because all this reform, but especially because precisely the economic problems of the North that end up defending all the opposition in Latin American elites in the first 2 decades of 21st century. New left governments that we can see in Latin American countries with political programs based on fight against inequality advanced very slowly, since they did not abandon seriously the monetary and fiscal policy of the neoliberalism. The neoliberalism's consolidation in social and economic life was achieved. The opposition accepted the basic principles of the neoliberalism. Sorry. The neoliberalist reforms and austerity policy have damaged institutions, the legitimacy of the government, the administration of justice, of course, the decentralization of the government with the most basic responsibilities going to the subnational governments and private corporations like health and education. All this destroyed deeply the institutions, which finally goes to a growing illicit business like human traffic, drugs, falsification, etc. All this illicit business that we know and we have in Latin America. Economic and political consequences were visible in various outbreaks of armed violence, exponential increase in social and gender violence, among others. And especially the violence, the gender violence must be underlined in Latin America and of course in all around the world with the neoliberalism. The most advanced and with widespread neoliberal reforms were about or has been those that modify labor markets condition, that enlarge working time and reduce the leisure time. Increase leisure time, by the way, it is at least words that difficult to have to find in Latin American in our countries. The increased difficulties on transportation and housing, the malnourish of the working people, and the deterioration of the public health services, education, and retirement system. All this, of course, create a very good or a solid basis for the development of COVID, the pandemic in Latin American countries, the malnourish of the working people, the increase of difficulties in housing, and of course, all the deterioration in health services and the systems of health and education. Well, the third part of our paper is about financial and health crisis, which this crisis is destroying the caring for life work that we need in Latin America and all around the world and in Latin American countries. First one sorry, this reform in all these reforms that support the commodification of the fiction's goods, like money, lands, and that money, land, and work, and the fiction commodities as underlying financial assets adds risk to the financial markets. In part, several of the well-known artificial intelligence innovations are contending with uncertainty arise from such false commodities. These include robotization, mining and blockchain technology, big data for healthcare, agriculture and water, and among others. This is now aimed to control the market, concentrate the ownership, and commodifying the condition of women's well-being. The COVID pandemic, the pandemic of COVID, then it is a result, at least in Latin America, but I think that it is around the world, for decades of overexploitation of nature and human beings. The liberalizing of reforms relating to fiction goods, especially labor, had led to a constant and systematic decline of society. The very objective of life care as an essential condition of social reproduction is outside of almost all government agenda. Imposed market solution to the health crisis are used to cope with critical moments, such as medical equipment and vaccines.
Sorry, Eugenia, 2 minutes left.
2 minutes, thank you. Yes, I just want to add that the contra trends are very weak right now. The contra trends based on the idea that using the economy in favor to social development look like isolated efforts. The austerity are winning. Social mechanisms to contain misery and poverty hardly escape to the neoliberal context. And the fears, terrifies, and paralyze the COVID SARS to paralyze the society. The abrasive COVID and the greatly has been unstoppable. Then I'm not very, very optimistic about the results and the post-COVID life main trends in the post-COVID world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eugenia, for your presentation. We have now the last presentation of this session, and it is the presentation of Rámon Vicente García Fernández. Rámon is the winner of the Shame Streets Award this year, so congratulations for this recognition of the Association for Evolutionary Economics. We all will also listen to your presentation.
Okay, Emilia, thanks. I'll share my presentation first. Okay, my presentation is called South America in the 21st Century, 20 Years on a Roller Coaster. And the roller coaster analogy, obviously, it refers to the ups and downs of the political trends and economic policy in South America. And when I began to think about the presentation, when moving from the abstract to the paper, I discovered that actually I needed to make a book-length essay. So this will be just needed to be reduced and will be a rather sketchy scheme for the paper and for this presentation, okay? So let's just moving forward. Okay, so the outline of the presentation is I basically speak about the basically a brief introduction, the history, the theory that is basically Karl Polanyi double movement, and then I will go back to our history and to our days to finish with some vignettes. And what's about the roller coaster? The idea basically is in the beginning of the 1990s, South American countries embraced neoliberalism, the Washington Consensus. After a period of enthusiasm, the region was hit by severe recessions and a series of crises. There was a reversal of all that and a period of optimism that has been called the progressive pink tide, that consisted of government with popular support all over the subcontinent, steady growth, reduction of inequality, social policies, environmental concerns. But there was an exhaustion of the pink tide and a political reversal, and we are having hard times in South America in the current days. Here is the pink tide. Maybe the pink tide is not the best name for it, but it has been used. So it's to say that it's a rather simultaneous group of progressive governments in the region, okay? And of the 10 South American countries, I would say that 7 are clearly in the pink tide: Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Ecuador, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Venezuela. And 3 are what I call a weak pink tide. That means that they are not actually in the pink tide, but that in those periods, those governments were more on the left than all the possible alternatives in each of these countries, okay? So I skipped this part. Carlos and Eugenia have presented it clearly, all the history of the roller coaster. What we need to remember is that in the 80s, we had the debt crisis, we had the way out of the debt crisis, and the lost decade was the Washington Consensus and the implementation of neoliberalism. The neoliberal truths came to be accepted in the 90s that said that the only solution for South American countries was to adopt wholeheartedly neoliberal policies because there is no alternative, the famous TINA. And all the problems of South American countries were a consequence of erroneous anti-market policies adopted in the former decades. Many of them were populist, others designed to warrant rents to elite groups, but all them created several distortions in the markets. But this, although these truths became popular in the beginning of the 90s, as the decade went forward, the tide began to turn, the model began to fail. To give an example, in 1999, per capita GDP diminished in the 10 countries of the region, and there were political crises summing up with the recession. So then we need to go to the theory. What's the theory we use to understand this? Is Karl Polanyi double movement, okay? What is a double movement? It's produced by a tension caused by an aim of the markets to expand and the reaction of the society to defend itself against the potentially unbearable consequences of that same expansion. The society's answer leads to a series of movements and counter-movements that constitute the double movement. Okay? For Polanyi, markets are the institutional pattern existing to channel the principle of exchange, one of the principles of behavior he studies, and the market serves no other purpose than the operation of this principle. But the problem is that creates a sphere of its own, an economic system that can disembed itself from the rest of the society. That's the problem with the markets, okay? What Polanyi says, it's clear that all along human history, from the Industrial Revolution, all along human history, from the archaic societies on, humans have been living with markets, okay? but markets have been part of the societies. The problem is that with the Industrial Revolution onwards, markets began to get released, okay, along political fight, led to the release of the markets and the creation of the market society, and that's different, the market society, from just mere markets, okay? And decade later, however, the same triumph of the market system led to its failure. It's the famous first sentence of the Great Transformation. 19th century civilization has collapsed, okay? But the problem is that after Polanyi wrote, because basically when Polanyi describes the double movement, essentially as one big process, he speaks of its ups and downs. We all have read about the poor laws, about Spinhamland, okay? But the narrative goes as leading to the constitution of a market society, its collapse, and the problem is that later, after Polanyi wrote, market system recovered, okay? So history showed that the double movement did not end with the collapse of the 19th century civilization, okay? And neoliberalism is an attempt to recreate the market society. And also we have now counter movements. So what Polanyi described has not stopped, okay? Okay, and what are the markets useful for? Basically, markets are useful to allocate economic goods. What are economic goods? The ones that are created to be sold, okay? But the problem is that markets in a market society create fictitious commodities. They raise a market for land, labor, and money, but we believe that this list can be increased with other things that are not made to be sold, especially education, health, and the right to retire. These are three things that are not in the original group of fictitious commodities, but that I believe that can be treated in this way, okay? Especially because the welfare state did not mess around too much with the basically land, part labor, part money, but essentially the reaction of the welfare state was to provide this other kind of commodities, okay, of fictitious commodities, to the state to provide education, health, right to retire, okay? And the reaction of neoliberalism has been to privatize, to marketize all these all these different fictitious commodities, okay? And what can a government do, okay, when you have a kind of fictitious, when you have this problem of the double movement? What's the role of the market? So here I go to a text by John Wiseman. He says, the state was radically transformed from what Marx characterized as the executive committee of the ruling class to an executive instrument of the masses to limit the elite's capacity to capture disproportionate shares of income, wealth, and privilege. So essentially the state has been, opens at least the possibility to stop, or at least to be part of the counter movement against this commodification of society, this marketization of society, okay? Okay. Well, okay, we have some in South America and Latin America, we have some legislation from the very early 20th century, but the promise of making a welfare state in Latin America remained completely unfulfilled. And with neoliberalism, even the few things that had been gained began to be lost again, okay? So in the 1990s, the years of the Washington Consensus, the South America had a reasonable performance in the first half of the decade, but later it began to turn the tide. Riots and demonstrations in many countries by the end of the 90s. And here are some pink tide landmarks, especially the election of Chavez, Lula, Kirchner, Tabaré Vázquez, Evo Morales, Correa. But a very symbolic thing was the defeat of the creation of the free trade area of the Americas in the Mar del Plata summit in 2005, where George W. Bush was personally present, and the idea was defeated. And at the same time, there were created another group of associations, like the Bolivarian Association, the South American Union of Nations, that were alternatives in which the South American countries united without the United States to try to gain momentum for the counter movement, if you want to say it so. Okay. Then some features of the pink tide governments: increasing confidence in the role of the state, bigger faith on domestic markets, industrial policies, the importance of state-owned enterprises. Inclusively, you have the nationalization of some stuff that had been privatized. There were income policies, concentration of income fell. There were bigger environmental concerns, especially Bolivia and Ecuador introduced the concept of the good living. So when you go to statistics, and I know of course, when Jenica and John Hall have presented that the GDP is not the best indicator, but we see here it's a proxy. And actually, in 8 of the 10 countries, the pink tide performance was better than in the other periods. And even in Peru, that is not actually one of the pink tide, it's really even. And the great difference is Venezuela, but up to the Chavez period, the performance, the Venezuelan growth was very close to the other period growth. So actually we have that in in the South American countries during the pink tide, the performance or was similar to the non-pink tide governments, or in certain cases it was clearly better, like in Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil, Bolivia. So the idea is that the double movement certainly helps to understand the emergence of the pink tide, but the problem is that these changes introduced by the pink tide revealed to not be so solid. To solidify these changes, the government should have provoked a deeper structural change in the societies. At the same time, whether it's doubtful whether they had the political force and even the political will and strength to modify them. So the changes made by the pink tide governments revealed to be unsustainable and were easily reversed in some. So to close, I have some vignettes. It's not for the next decade. The first one, the idea that the effective political support of the pink tide was weaker than imagined. Essentially, that means that it's not enough to win the election, so being the president be part of the pink tide, the president via progressive, because it showed that wide alliances of the leftist parties with conservative parties led to parliamentary coups, being the greater examples Paraguay and Brazil. The second question is that, you can have the executive and even the Congress, but they may not be enough to promote changes because they are what is known as lawfare, that is the joint political pressures of the judiciary and the mass media to destroy reputation, etc. So it's not enough to have Congress and executive. The third thing is that when we think of the policies, it's impossible to try to make a Scandinavian welfare state in South America, especially because both the Social Democrats have gone to the right and even the neoliberals have mimicked some of the policies of the Social Democrats. So it's we have what Gabriel Palma calls a Gramscian moment, a situation in which the old is dying, but the new does not find a way to get born. And this is the last point, which are the consequences of the double movement. What means a double movement? And here, using a concept of Jeff Goodwin, I would say that to intervene is to decommodificate. Okay, it's necessary to intervene in the markets, limit the markets, and prevent or reverse commodification. And it can be suggested that the pink tie governments were generous in their interventions, discreet in their limited, and way too shy in their prevention of reversion, especially in the cases of Argentina and Brazil. Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela were far more emphatic. So that's what I call, if we perhaps have a Gramscian Polanyian moment, that is the idea that there is an impulse, a strong counter movement operating in these days. That's what I believe. And this counter movement, this Polanyian counter movement, can help to find the way out of the stalemate that is what Palma calls the Gramscian moment. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ramon, for your presentation, and thank you to all the authors that have participated in this session. We have to move to the section of questions or comments. We have already 4 questions and comments in the chat box. You can feel free to ask questions. I can read them. So I will start by, I will read them because I'm not sure if everyone can read them. The first comment is from Professor Wolfram Esner, wants to say to John, congratulations for your still lucky hand to promote young scholars and bring them into institutional analysis. The following questions is from Felipe Almeida to Carlos. And the question is it possible to perceive a conflict between vested interests and common people in Brazil in the period your paper relies on? It's to Professor Carlos Medeiros.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you for a question. But I think that in this period, what's a very strange thing happened, because the common people was very influenced at the time of the 80s and 90s by progressive thought. And even, I would say, that came from Catholic Church. And this was a connection between the old Labour Party and even and left-wing sides of Catholic Church that was very important for Labour Party, and to support the idea that the government has to do something in order to diminish the income inequality and all that. But in the last years, I mean, from the beginning of 2010, another idea, I think, that became very strong among the poor people. As a matter of fact, 2 ideas, broad ideas. One idea that came from what I say, the evangelicals, or the theology of prosperity, there is support the idea of self-made man, that man that helps itself and pray to God and all that. And the idea that the solidarity is not a very issue, very important in society, because the most important thing is commitment from the individual to the pastor and all, the prayer and all that. And the other idea that is very strong is the idea that the population has to act against the robber and the bandits using weapons. And as a solution to face the big problem of violence in Brazil. And I think that these the two ideas that came from theology of prosperity and the myth of the idea that the population has the right to do something against, by themselves, against the violence, open the door for a right-wing perspective that is very different from the, so I think that these ideas penetrate very deep in the conscience of the population, the poor, people living in slums and all that. So this is what I say to you.
Thank you, Carlos. The following question is from Abraham Barnes, and it's to Jenica and John. Thank you for an excellent and important presentation. I was wondering if you will comment on water features being traded on Wall Street and how it might relate to the way in which we as institutionalists approach climate policy. Sorry.
I'll let Jenica answer.
Hi, thank you for the question. That's a good question, and I don't think I can speak directly to the market for water futures. I would say maybe that's a good avenue for further research if the person asking the question has more knowledge in that area than I do. I think it can be, I think it's part of neoliberal environmentalism, basically. It can be conceptualized as the neoliberal response to climate change, basically, like accepting that water scarcity is becoming more and more of a reality for many people across the world. It's being exacerbated by climate change. And the vested interests are well aware of that and are ready to profit from it. There's a term in environmental ecological literature or whatever called disaster capitalism, where, you know, for instance, when Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico, you know, it was devastating. And I can't remember which, it was a prominent politician in Puerto Rico addressed a panel of like business leaders, up and coming people from around the world, basically saying that please come to Puerto Rico now. It is a clean slate for you to develop. I think it was, they were talking about Bitcoin sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, I think that the neoliberal state's response to climate change is either to profit from ecological disaster. It sees an opportunity in the changing landscapes, the changing climate. You know, the ice caps melting opens up an opportunity to go dig for oil. One example among many. Or, you know, if the response is not to profit from it, it is to combat climate change, which I think the wording is very important because they combat it by increasing militarization, basically. You know, with the changing climate, we see increasing numbers of climate refugees, more, you know, there's a lot of movements on the ground of people who are resisting the extractive industries around the world. So people are, rising up to, literally put their bodies, on the line to stop, stop mining in Peru, or, stop the building of infrastructure that will, degrade the environment further. And the response of the neoliberal state has been to, totally increase militarization. So I think water futures, I think it's a wonderful topic to explore. I think that on the second part, what institutionalists can contribute there is to work to uncover basically to uncover the parasite, to uncover the predatory behavior of neoliberal environmentalism, to say, to not just accept that, okay, we are working towards sustainable solutions just because, the neoliberal state says we are, to actually look at it and to reject also we should reject the neoclassical conceptualization of nature by, reject bringing it into the market so that it is valuable, because nature is valuable just because it is, it just is. So that's a very good question. Thank you. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jenica. The next question is also from Felipe Almeida to Rámon. First of all, congratulations on the James Street Scholar Award. And regarding Brazil, during the time you consider in your paper, a great status change took place. Poor and less wealthy people were occupying elites' places. They were consuming elites' goods and service, and their daughters and sons became students at great universities, sometimes excluding elites' daughters and sons. The returning of neoliberalism in Brazil is related to that elite's loss of status, as far as I understand. Does status change play a role in your paper?
Okay, thank you, Emilia, and thank you, Felipe, for the question. Thanks for. I'm also very happy to have earned the James Street Scholar Award. So it's okay. But going to your question, I think what I was describing basically is the idea that we have the double movements. Now the movement pro-markets has been, in a certain sense, the essence of what has happened with neoliberalism in the whole world, especially in South America. This return of the markets, okay, is I think that it's the central part of neoliberalism, and I think that this is the part that certainly Polanyi explains better. Okay, but I think there are more things, and for example, what neoliberalism is, as I understand it, is more just than the return of the market. It's not any return of the markets. It's a very, very special return of the markets with a high concentration of income, of wealth, of everything. It's really because, for example, you could say, can it be another possible world with markets in another fashion? A return, say, what the German, how we call it, the ordo liberals of the 1950s were thinking, a kind of a popular market capitalism. It could be a possible world, but not this one. In this world, neoliberalism has the return of the markets with a very strong elite concentration of wealth, income, whatever. And to do this, you need to include other things besides other authors, other great thinkers besides Polanyi. And certainly that this is what you are mentioning. Perhaps we need to go obviously to Veblen, to Marx, to understand this kind of a specific aspect of neoliberalism. Okay, so the return of the markets has been also, or let's say another word, the counter movement led to a better social situation, all that you describe in your question. And certainly the answer has been to block, to prevent people to get people coming from the lower classes to go up. Okay, so I think it's your observation is perfect. It's just that what I described was not. I was thinking more on the process of the markets, up and down or to and fro. But certainly there are more than markets. This kind of invidious, the recreation of invidious distinctions is a central aspect that I have not developed in my paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Rámon. The next question is from Faruk Ulgen, and says, thanks for this amazing session. I'd like to ask a remark question related to the presentation of Eugenia. Eugenia says that the work in Latin American countries is regarded and felt as an awful constraint given the physical, political, and financial conditions. People then don't ask for more work, but rather prefer a kind of universal income to get access to subsistence. I agree with this analysis that is conform to the characteristics of capitalist accumulation-seeking economic society. My question is, therefore, might it be more suitable to talk about the contribution of citizens to common social life through the work as a social integration processes conferred depth yesterday presentation in terms of the transformation of society, such as that the work of full employment will not be thought of as a capitalist slavery, but in terms of societal gathering? May a universal income be a step in this direction?
Thank you very much for the question of Faruk, and good morning, good afternoon, Faruk. It is very good to see you. I want to say that that this question about the work as a modern capitalist slavery, it is more recently, and it is present in a different what do you say, in a different segments of the workers. It is not a general phenomenon, at least until now. There are many sectors of the society, at least in Latin American countries, in which the work continue to be a pride activity, relation, and a very satisfactory moment of the life, very important moment of relationship, social relationship, etc. But there are also another part of section or sectors of the workers that really have not this kind of satisfactions, and even the satisfaction of the salaries are very of the wages are very small, because this strong, let's say, exploitation of the workers, and the society, which is calling all the time about consumption and consumption and consumption too. Then it is very difficult to have a decision right now, but I'm completely convinced that the universal income, it is at least in Latin America for nowadays, it is a way to separate the society, to have a more individualistic answer to this problem, and don't create really a strong relationship inside our society, to try to build up another kind of social relationships. Then I'm not agree with the, just for underline, I'm not agree with universal income as a step in the direction of rebuild the societies in our countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Eugenia. There is a question of Smitas Nivas. Thanks to all the panelists. Is there an opportunity, given the rich papers, to further specify the term neoliberal and narrow it? For example, are there some policies, institutional combinations that are used in some countries for some times and not used in others? Is there used to clarify different types of neoliberalism by some number or type of market expansion, or specify what is not a neoliberal institutional context? Are there gradations we should be labeling? Thank you. This is an open question, so anyone who wants to answer.
I want to say something in that direction, and it is important. At least I believe it, that the neoliberalists have a core, and the core of the neoliberalists are precisely the monetary and fiscal policies. And if you don't change the monetary and fiscal policy, there are not changes in the neoliberalism direction of our societies. Then there are not this kind of what did you say, gradation in neoliberalism. Even I listen in Mexico and other countries, the idea that the neoliberalists have a good things and bad things. No, bad things are this one and this one. No, neoliberalists have a core, and the core is political, monetary and fiscal policies, and we need to break down those policies. Well, it's...
Yeah, I agree quite well with what Eugenia has said. And I think that, you know, neoliberalism can consider in different degrees. And in this gradation depends on how the, what I say, that political coalition support strongly the idea that the state has major task as to please the property classes. You know, the idea, the broad idea is that investment will come if the property class are happy with the political economy, and this political economy means a lot of ideas in that combines a small state, or not a small state, but a state that regulates in direction of the property classes, and a lot of social or let's say social transference has to be submitted. The idea of criteria, very targets to some people, very needed people, but not in general, because you know, the state cannot afford this. This is the idea that all the time the limits is the fiscal side of the state, because the broad idea is that if you put state in this picture, you have to finance the state. And if you have to finance the state, you have to tax the rich people. So in order to not bother rich people with high tax, you have to put the states in more in a direction that is supporting this kind of policies. This is, I think, was.
I think that we have to go a little beyond thinking of neoliberalism as simply policies, and continue to think of it as an ideology, because the reason that the policies can be implemented is because the society as a whole and the people in the society have fundamentally accepted the underlying social mythology which supports those policies. So it's not just a matter of changing the policies. As you found in many of your examples, you change the policies for 5 years, but the ideology ultimately reasserts itself. because it's accepted by all the political actors and most of the public at the same time. So I think it's not just a matter of resisting policies, it's a matter of also undermining that fundamental ideology which supports it.
Can I just, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead,
John, go ahead. No, John, it's
you're our street scholar. Go ahead. You're our special guest this year.
Okay, thanks. No, what I think that what Carlos and Eugenia have said is okay, it's perfect, but I'm perhaps more in the line of what Bill was saying, that we have to understand neoliberalism as more as a wide cultural movement. It goes, of course, it has its economic policies, but it's something I think wider. At least, and so it's impossible to answer the question in just this session. But I at least I have been very impressed by Phil Mirovsky's analysis relating all this to the Mount Pelerin society and all the cultural process that has been working for the last 70 years actually to create this cultural environment good for developing the neoliberal ideology. So I would pass now to John to complete, and later I would go to ask a question to Bill going from this point.
I just wanted to get more specific with Smita's question. And as I understood it, what she's asking is, do we have ways to look at the differences of how neoliberalism manifests itself in different national settings? So I thought long and hard about the title of this panel, and it's on neoliberalism's appearances and machinations. And I feel that with the contributions coming in, we really developed this theme. And so my answer to Smita is in line with Bill and also of Rámon, and that is neoliberalism has distinct manifestations depending on the political economy of the country involved and the class structure and other characteristic features that institutionalists appreciate. But I think it's correct to say it's a global movement, and we trace it back, as Mirovsky taught us, to the Mont Pelerin Society. And they had an agenda. It took them years to endure the Keynesian era, and that now they dominate. And so it's essentially everywhere. And sadly, even in my state university, I get to see all the tragic signs of systematically putting low-income students into debt before they're 22 years old. And so that would be my answer to Smita. I don't think it's so useful to work out an index that shows one country is more neoliberal than the other. I think it's correct just to say it's the air we breathe now, and then we have the paper that I wrote with Jean Marie, and our concern really is that we're on a destructive course. I think that Eugenia has underlined that even more than we have. But our point of view is that if we look at the world ecology, it's more or less the final stage of, final stage of history. And that's our concern with our research.
Okay, we have 11 minutes left for the session and 2 questions. The first one is from John Watkins, and it's a question to the paper of Bill and Mary. Your paper reminds me of the Weber thesis that the spirit of capitalism and its origins in the rise of Protestantism, specifically Puritanism. I am amused, though, that the prosperity gospel does not explain from where the goods come, unlike the Weber thesis. I think the idea of both babes incredible sexist. I don't know, do you want to answer?
I agree that it's an interesting peculiarity, but again, I would go back to the notion of ideology. Momtrepreneurs and the way entrepreneurs is used in all of neoliberal discourse in the United States does not refer to anything related to Schumpeter's concept, but it is simply a title appropriated by anyone who has business. It is, as David Hamilton wrote in the 1950s, it's a concept of a cultural hero here and not related to their actual activity. It is interesting that the goods are irrelevant in multi-level marketing. I mean, that's why they don't have to worry about where the goods come from. The only thing that keeps these people out of prison is pretending they sell products, but they really don't care about products. This is just an excuse to perpetuate another pyramid scheme on people who have desperate needs for income for the most part. That's why women, particularly stay-at-home mothers, have been targeted. The Latino and Hispanic community has been targeted by these firms. And of course, their influence is beyond anything you could imagine. I mean, Betsy DeVos and her billions of dollars came from Amway. They helped fund her, one of the relatives who runs Blackwater, which many of its employees were just pardoned for war crimes. They have translated cleaning products into an empire, not through selling cleaning products, but by defrauding poor people. And it's the perfect neoliberal firm, creating the maximum rate of return on the production and sale of nothing but hope.
Thank you. And there is a question of Tai Heyo. Following Bill's comment, it appears that changes in government policy or a degree of government intervention into the market will not end neoliberalism. What would be the most important and fundamental institutional arrangement that is required from your viewpoint to end neoliberalism in Latin America in particular?
I certainly can't answer a question about Latin America, but plenty of people here can. So.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a very difficult question, but there's no particular institution that I think that we have to think in a coalition that combines different groups and social classes fighting for a different kind of relation and compromise of states with society. And I think that's in the case of, for instance, I think that in the case of Argentina, the population has much more active demonstration and politicization that is easier for a government just not to go too fast in the direction of neoliberalism, because you know, there is such a kind of measure that is act as a countervailing force. And I think that in other case, the countervailing force is the proper economy. You know, an economy in a big recession is a situation that may convince the dominant groups and classes that has things very different has to be done in order to make in a society survive and all that. So I think that there is no a final answer. I think that it depends on how the society is organized and how the possibilities are open to change. So I think so.
I want to add one minute more to that question, and it is precisely that I'm very pessimistic about the breakdown of the neoliberalism in Latin America, and I think that the COVID has been a proof. Let's say, for example, in Mexico, a proof that the neoliberalism, that the governments of the left governments need to break down the core of the neoliberalism, which are monetary and fiscal policy. But I think also that maybe a huge step against the neoliberalism in Latin America is in particular a new labor reform. A new labor reform in which we really can modify radically the terms of the condition of the workers in the market. I think so. Maybe that could help to the question of that give us a role. Thank you.
Okay. Can I add just one minute? No, I think that the big problem obviously is the state, okay? Because you can have, in part, neoliberalism is in part the idea to take the state to recreate markets. So that's the crucial place for the conflict. Because on the one side, you have people, I think in Brazil, it's very clear, people that has a strong restrictions on the people in the popular classes. You have people that they don't like the state. They believe that the state is always evil. And I think that on the other side, it's, as I said in my quote from John Wiseman, I think that in a democratic society, the state is our resource. So if we just let them take the state and believe that it's unimportant, we can't make those changes. So I think that the big question is essentially how to convince people again that the state can be in our side.
Thank you very much, Ramon, and for all the answers. I am from Latin America, I am from Argentina, so I completely agree with your reflections regarding the importance of rethinking and re-problematize the role of the state, but also what Carlos says about the relations of forces and who is going to promote these changes in the ways of state intervention and configuration, and regarding the ideas that circulate inside or within the states. So I think that we could keep on discussing these issues, are very interested in general, but we are arriving at the end of this session. So I would like to thank you very, very much to the presenters and also to the audience in general, all the participants in this session. And I would also like to thank publicly to Professor John Holt for organizing this panel, and to Professor John Wilkins for inviting me to chair these sessions. It was a pleasure for me. So thank you very much, and I hope you have enjoyed.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Nice
Bye,
to see
everybody.
you
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Stay healthy.
Thank
Stay
you.
healthy.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay. Stay healthy.
Yeah.